The silence in my apartment had its own texture. It was a thick, woolly thing, woven from the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sigh of traffic 3 stories down, and the scratch of my own pen against paper. For 3 years, since I moved into Unit 3A, that silence had been my most constant companion. It was a silence I had cultivated, a fortress built after the noise of my last relationship had finally, blessedly, died out. I lived in the quiet, I worked in the quiet, and mostly, I was content with it. My life was a series of predictable, manageable loops. Wake, coffee, draw, lunch, draw, dinner, read, sleep. I was an illustrator of children's books, a job that suited my preference for solitude. I created worlds of talking squirrels and adventurous bears from the safety of my drafting table, my window overlooking the brick wall of the building next door. My neighbor across the hall, in 3B, was a man who seemed to understand silence. Arthur. I only knew his name from the little brass plate on his door and the occasional package left in the lobby. He was older than me, maybe by 15 years, with silver carving paths through his dark hair and a body that spoke of a life lived doing physical things. He was a widower, the building's resident gossip. Mrs. Gable from the first floor had made sure everyone knew that. His wife, Helen, had passed away about a year before I moved in. I rarely saw him, and when I did, it was a brief, silent nod in the hallway. He had a stillness about him, a gravity that seemed to pull the air in closer. His eyes, a deep and quiet gray, held a sadness that felt permanent, like a stain on a well-worn coat. I found myself observing him in those fleeting moments, cataloging the weary set of his shoulders, the way his hands, broad and calloused, would rest on the doorframe for a moment before he went inside. He was a piece of the building's quiet architecture, a fixture I had grown accustomed to but never truly interacted with. Until Tuesday. It was raining, a relentless, drumming rain that blurred the city into a watercolor wash. The sound amplified the silence inside, making it feel less like a comfort and more like a container. I was trying to get the expression right on a badger who'd lost his favorite acorn, my brow furrowed in concentration, when a knock sounded at my door. It was a soft, hesitant sound, so at odds with the storm outside that I almost thought I'd imagined it. No one ever knocked on my door. Packages were left, takeout was buzzed up from the lobby. A direct knock was an anomaly, an unwelcome stone tossed into the placid pond of my routine. I opened the door a few inches, the security chain still latched. It was him, Arthur. He stood there, looking profoundly uncomfortable, his big frame seeming to shrink in the narrow hallway. He was wearing a simple gray t-shirt and worn jeans, and his feet were bare on the faded floral runner. He smelled faintly of soap and damp earth. "Sorry to bother you," he said. His voice was just as I'd imagined it might be, low and with a rough, gravelly texture, like stones rolling in a slow river. It was a voice that didn't seem to get much use. "It's no bother," I lied, my heart giving a strange, unpracticed little jump. Up close, the lines around his eyes were deeper, etched by sun or worry or both. "Is everything all right?" He shifted his weight, and for a moment, I thought he might just turn and leave. He held up a small, white tube. "This is going to sound strange," he started, his gaze fixed somewhere over my shoulder. I pulled something in my back. In my shoulder. "The doctor gave me this stuff, but I can't reach the spot." He finally met my eyes, and the sheer, unvarnished awkwardness in them was disarming. "My son usually helps when he visits, but he's out of town. I wouldn't ask, but it's really seizing up." My brain took a moment to process the request. The widower from across the hall wanted me to touch him. The thought sent a bizarre little shockwave through me. My life was so devoid of physical contact that shaking a cashier's hand felt momentous. This was something else entirely. "Oh, of course," I said, my voice sounding thin. I fumbled with the chain, my fingers suddenly clumsy. "Come in." He stepped inside, and his presence immediately changed the landscape of my small apartment. It was as if a large, solid piece of furniture had been added. He dwarfed my entryway, his shoulders seeming to brush both sides of the wall. He stood on the small rug, looking around as if he'd entered a foreign country. My space was filled with books, stacks of paper, and the scent of ink and coffee. His was, I imagined, filled with the ghosts of a shared life. "It's just this one spot," he said, turning his back to me and pointing to a place just below his right shoulder blade. Right there. It's a devil to get to. Okay, I breathed, taking the tube of cream from his hand. His skin was warm. The tube was cool. My own hands felt cold and clammy. I squeezed a dollop of the white cream onto my fingers. It smelled medicinal, a sharp, minty scent that cut through the air. T-shirt off, I asked, and the question hung in the air, feeling ridiculously intimate. He nodded, and with a smooth, practiced motion, pulled the gray shirt over his head. And I stopped breathing. His back was a landscape. It was broad and mapped with muscle that was soft and defined at the same time. His skin was tanned, dotted with a few faint scars and moles, a testament to a life lived outdoors, a life lived in the sun. A small, silvered scar curved near his spine. I wondered where it came from. Every inch of him felt like a story I didn't know how to read. My world was paper and ink. His was skin and bone and muscle. Just right there, he repeated, his voice a little strained. I took a hesitant step forward. The air between us felt charged, thick with the sound of the rain and my own frantic pulse. I raised my hand, my fingers hovering over his warm skin for a beat before making contact. His skin was hot, firm. The muscles beneath my fingers were coiled tight, like thick rope. As I began to rub the cream in, a small sound escaped his throat, a low groan of relief that vibrated through his body and into my hand. I tried to focus on the task, to be clinical, medical, but it was impossible. I was touching this man, this quiet, sad man from across the hall. I was kneading the tension from his body with my own fingers. My movements were clumsy at first, then more confident as I felt the knot of muscle begin to yield. I worked in slow, deliberate circles, my entire world shrinking to the space of my hand on his back. I could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing. I could smell the clean, simple scent of his skin beneath the mint of the cream. I was so focused, so lost in the sensory details, that I barely noticed when his own hand came up, covering mine. His hand was huge, engulfing mine completely. It was rough, the palm calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. For a second, I thought he was going to tell me to stop, that I was done. But he didn't. Instead, he applied a soft, steady pressure, guiding my hand. He moved it downward, slowly, deliberately, away from his shoulder blade and into the valley of his spine. My heart hammered against my ribs. What is happening? My hand, under his, slid over the warm, smooth skin of his lower back. The muscles there were different, softer. We moved past the epicenter of his pain, into territory that felt other. He guided my palm to the small of his back, to the dip just above the waistband of his jeans. And there, his hand paused, pressing mine firmly against him. He didn't let go. He just held my hand there, flush against his skin, his thumb stroking the back of my knuckles once, a barely there movement that sent a tremor straight up my arm. Time seemed to stretch and warp. The rain drummed on. His breathing was a low, steady bass line. My own was a frantic, silent treble. He was still facing away from me. I couldn't see his expression. I couldn't read anything except the solid, undeniable pressure of his hand on mine, holding me to him. He was not stopping me. He was not pulling away. He was guiding me. My mind raced, a frantic scramble of confusion and a terrifying, exhilarating hope. Was this intentional? Was I misreading this? Was this just a widower's lonely, accidental gesture? Or was it a question? After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 seconds, his hand loosened. He gently lifted his hand from mine, leaving my palm resting, tingling and bereft, on the small of his back. The absence of his touch was more shocking than its presence had been. He cleared his throat. That's much better, he said, his voice thick. Thank you, Leo. He knew my name. Of course he knew my name. It was on my door, just like his was on his. But hearing him say it, in that low, rough voice, in the charged silence of my apartment, made it sound new. He reached for his shirt, and I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned. He pulled the shirt on, hiding the landscape of his back from my view. He turned to face me, and his gray eyes were impossible to read. There was no smirk, no hint of a come on. There was just a quiet intensity, a watchfulness. Anytime, I managed to choke out, my throat dry. I appreciate it, he said, moving toward the door. Seriously, he paused with his hand on the knob, his gaze meeting mine one last time. It lingered for a heartbeat too long, a silent, weighted moment that seemed to hold a dozen unspoken sentences. Then he was gone, the door clicking softly shut behind him, leaving me alone in my apartment with the scent of mint and the ghost of his skin under my palm. I stood frozen in the middle of my living room for a long time, listening to the rain. The silence that rushed back in was different now. It was no longer a comfortable, woolly blanket. It was thin, and it was ringing with questions. The days that followed were a special kind of torture, orchestrated entirely by my own overactive imagination. Every creak in the hallway was him. Every time I left my apartment, my heart did a little stutter step, a mix of terror and hope that I would see him. Our encounters reverted to their previous state of brief nods and near silence. Yet everything was different. The space between us was no longer empty. It was filled with the memory of that 10-second eternity of his hand on mine. I became a ridiculous, obsessive observer. From the peephole of my door, I'd watch him leave in the mornings. He had a specific routine. At 7:30, he'd emerge wearing worn work boots and a Carhartt jacket, a thermos in his hand. He worked part-time at a local hardware store, a fact I'd gleaned from Mrs. Gable months ago. He moved with a purpose, a quiet economy of motion that I found mesmerizing. I'd watch until the elevator doors closed, then lean my forehead against the cool wood of my own door, feeling pathetic and insane. I started analyzing our fleeting hallway interactions with the focus of a cryptographer deciphering an ancient code. A morning, Leo was no longer just a greeting. It was the specific timbre of his voice, the way his eyes met mine for a fraction of a second. Did his gaze linger? Did the corner of his mouth twitch? Almost a smile? Probably not. It was almost certainly all in my head. But the possibility that it wasn't kept me tethered to this maddening cycle of hope and doubt. One afternoon, I was carrying a heavy box of art supplies from the mailroom. It was awkward and bulky, and as I fumbled for my keys, it slipped. Just as the corner was about to hit the floor, a large, calloused hand shot out and stabilized the bottom of the box. "Got it," Arthur's low voice said from right beside me. I jumped, startled. I hadn't even heard him approach. His arm was pressed against mine, his body close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. He smelled of sawdust and something clean, like fresh laundry. "Thanks," I stammered, my face flushing. I almost lost it. "Looks heavy," he observed, his hand remaining on the box, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was incidental, a complete accident. It shouldn't have meant anything, but it sent a jolt through my system, a powerful current that lit up every nerve ending from my fingers to my chest. I jerked my hand away reflexively. "It's just paper," I said, finally managing to get my key in the lock. He steadied the box as I pushed the door open, then helped me guide it into the entryway. "You an artist?" he asked, his eyes scanning the stacks of sketches and prints that littered every available surface. "Illustrator," I corrected, feeling suddenly self-conscious about the whimsical, colorful worlds I created. It felt childish compared to his grounded, practical reality of hardware and sawdust. "For children's books." He picked up a small watercolor of a fox in a waistcoat, holding it carefully by the edges. He studied it for a long moment. I held my breath, waiting for a polite but dismissive comment. "He looks like he's got a secret," Arthur said, a faint smile finally touching his lips. It transformed his face, softening the weary lines around his eyes. "You're good at this. Really good." The genuine praise caught me off guard. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He placed the painting back on the stack with reverence. "Well, I'll let you get back to it," he nodded once, his gray eyes holding mine for a moment, and then he was gone. I spent the rest of the day replaying the entire 2-minute encounter. His hand brushing mine. The unexpected smile. The way he'd said, "He looks like he's got a secret." It felt like he was talking about more than the fox. It felt like he was talking about me. Or maybe us. My mind was a relentless engine of what-ifs. What if I had left my hand there, against his? What if I had said something more than just thank you? What if he was just being a nice, neighborly man and I was a lonely, pathetic fool spinning fantasies out of thin air? This internal debate was exhausting. I tried to lose myself in my work, but Arthur kept creeping into the margins. The badger I was drawing started to have sad, thoughtful gray eyes. The stoic old oak tree in the background began to look like it had his broad, steady shoulders. He was an invasive species in the carefully tended garden of my solitude. A week later, the storm hit. It wasn't just rain this time. It was a full-blown assault of thunder and wind. The lights in my apartment flickered once, twice, and then died completely, plunging me into a sudden, profound darkness. The hum of the refrigerator ceased, leaving a silence that was deeper and more absolute than any I had known before. And I hated it. I had always been irrationally afraid of the dark, a childish fear that had stubbornly followed me into adulthood. The wind howled, rattling my window frames, and with each crack of thunder, my apartment felt smaller, more fragile. I was fumbling for my phone, my hands shaking, when a knock came at the door. It was a firm, solid knock this time, not hesitant at all. I knew it was him. I stumbled to the door, my heart pounding in time with the thunder. I opened it to find Arthur standing in the hallway, which was illuminated by the emergency lights. He was holding an old-fashioned oil lantern, the flame inside casting a warm, flickering glow on his face. "Power's out for the whole block," he said. "You okay?" "Fine," I lied, my voice trembling slightly. He looked past me into the pitch-black cavern of my apartment. His expression softened with a perception that made me feel utterly transparent. "You don't look fine, Leo." He held up the lantern. "I've got candles. And a fireplace. No reason for both of us to sit in the dark. It was an offering. A life raft. And I was drowning." "Okay," I said, the word a rush of pure relief. I followed him across the hall into his apartment. It was the first time I had ever seen inside. It was the mirror image of mine in layout. But that's where the similarity ended. Where my place was a cluttered workshop of paper and creative chaos, his was neat, sparse, and calm. The furniture was solid, dark wood, a well-worn leather armchair, a sturdy coffee table, a bookshelf filled with paperbacks, their spines cracked from use. And on the far wall, a small fireplace was crackling merrily, casting dancing shadows across the room. The air smelled of old books, wood smoke, and something else, a faint, lingering floral scent, like dried lavender. "Helen," I thought. A framed photo on the mantelpiece confirmed it. It was Arthur and a woman with a warm, radiant smile. They were standing on a beach, his arm wrapped securely around her, his own smile wider and more carefree than I had ever seen it. A pang of something, guilt, intrusion, jealousy, shot through me. I was a stranger in this sanctuary of memory. "Have a seat," he said, gesturing to the armchair. "Can I get you something? I have whiskey, or I can heat water on the fire for tea." "Whiskey would be great," I said, needing something to steady my nerves. He handed me a heavy glass with a generous pour of amber liquid. He took a seat on the hearth, the firelight catching the silver in his hair. We sat in a comfortable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the howling of the storm outside. The warmth from the fireplace and the whiskey began to chase the chill from my bones. "Thank you for this," I said, breaking the silence. I'm not great with storms. Or the dark." I felt a compulsive need to be honest with him. He looked at me, his gray eyes soft in the firelight. Helen was the same. She'd make a pillow fort in the living room, and we'd hide in it like kids until the storm passed. He smiled at the memory, a sad, gentle curve of his lips. There was no bitterness in his voice, only a deep, abiding affection. "I'm sorry," I said, feeling like an intruder on his grief. "I shouldn't have." "Don't be sorry," he interrupted gently. "It's nice to say her name out loud. It gets quiet in here." He took a sip of his own drink. 3 years, and the silence is still the loudest thing in the room. His words resonated with me so deeply it was almost painful. He understood the texture of silence, too. But his was born of loss, mine of fear. "What do you do when you're not drawing talking animals?" he asked, changing the subject, his gaze curious. I don't, really," I admitted. "My work is my life, mostly. Everyone needs something else," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Something just for them." He stared into the fire. "I build things. Little things. Ship models. Takes my mind off everything. Requires focus. We talk for hours. Or rather, he talked, and I listened. He spoke of his wife, of their life together, of the hardware store, of his son who lived upstate. He spoke of simple things, but his words painted a life of deep connection and quiet contentment. He unspooled his past for me, not as a burden, but as a fact. as the foundation of the man he was now. And in his vulnerability, I felt a profound sense of safety. He wasn't a mystery to be solved. He was a man, lonely and kind, who seemed to see the same loneliness in me. The storm eventually passed, and the power flickered back on with a hum. The electric lights felt harsh and unwelcome after the soft glow of the fire. The spell was broken. I should go, I said, standing up. The apartment suddenly felt too small for the intimacy that had grown between us. Leo, he said, stopping me as I reached the door. I turned. He had stood up as well, and in the starker light, the lines of weariness were back on his face. My back's been acting up again. The damp weather. My breath caught in my throat. My heart started a slow, heavy drumbeat. This was it. This was the moment. The air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with the storm. I still have that cream, he said, his eyes locked on mine. It wasn't a question, but it was. It was a test. An invitation. Okay, I whispered. He disappeared into his bedroom for a moment and came back with the white tube. He didn't say anything else, just turned his back to me and pulled his shirt over his head in one fluid motion. This time, I didn't hesitate. The fire had warmed the room, and his skin seemed to radiate the heat. I squeezed the cream onto my fingers, the minty smell sharp and familiar. I placed my hands on his back, on the tight, not below his shoulder blade. My touch was different this time. It was not the tentative, clinical touch of a stranger. It was knowing. I worked the muscle with my thumbs, my movements sure and steady. He let out a low sigh, a sound that was less about pain relief and more about surrender. I let my hands wander, emboldened by the whiskey and the intimacy of our conversation. I traced the curve of his spine, the sweep of his ribs. He stood perfectly still, a silent, solid presence under my touch. My entire being was focused on this single act, on the glide of my hands over his skin. The world outside, the rain, my lonely apartment, it all fell away. There was only this room, the dying fire, and the man standing before me. Then, just as before, his hand came up and covered mine. The contact was electric, 1,000 times more potent than the first time. He didn't guide me to his shoulder. He didn't guide me anywhere. He just held my hand there, in the center of his back, our fingers intertwined. A silent acknowledgement. A confirmation. Slowly, deliberately, he turned around to face me. His other hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. His eyes, those unreadable gray eyes, were filled with a question that made my knees feel weak. He was so close I could see the flecks of charcoal and silver in his irises. I could feel his warm breath on my lips. This is it. This is real. My own hands, slick with cream, came up to rest on his waist, on the warm, solid flesh above the waistband of his jeans. It was a terrifying, exhilarating act of claiming. I was no longer a passive observer. I was a participant. Leo, he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. It was a question, a plea, and a statement all at once. And I, who had lived in silence for so long, finally found my voice. Arthur, I breathed back. That was all it took. He closed the small distance between us, and his mouth was on mine. The kiss wasn't frantic or desperate. It was slow and deep and devastatingly sure. It was a kiss that tasted of whiskey and wood smoke and 3 years of unspoken loneliness. His lips were firm but soft, moving against mine with a certainty that unraveled every knot of anxiety in my body. His stubble was a rough, pleasant abrasion against my skin. His hand moved from my jaw to the back of my neck, his fingers threading into my hair, holding me to him, not with force, but with an unmistakable sense of rightness. It felt like coming home to a place I'd never been before. My hands tightened on his waist, pulling him closer, wanting to erase the last fraction of an inch between us. His body was so solid, so real against mine. This was not a fantasy spun in my head during long, quiet afternoons. This was Arthur, and he was here, and he was kissing me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. A small sound escaped my throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. The tension that had been coiling inside me for weeks, for years, finally snapped. He pulled back just enough to rest his forehead against mine. Our eyes were closed. Our breath mingled in the warm air. His thumb stroked the sensitive skin behind my ear, and I shivered. I've wanted to do that, he murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through my chest. Since the first time you opened your door. My eyes snapped open. What? The first time? With the cream, he clarified, a small, wry smile playing on his lips. You looked so terrified and so gentle. I think I fell a little bit in love with the look in your eyes right then. My mind reeled. All that time I had spent agonizing, analyzing, convincing myself I was inventing everything. He had been feeling it, too. The mutual pining, the unspoken longing, it had been real. It hadn't just been me. The relief of that realization was so immense, it almost brought me to my knees. I thought I was going crazy, I confessed, my voice shaky. I thought I was imagining everything. You weren't imagining anything, he said, his voice firm. He laced his fingers with mine, our hands sticky with lotion. He didn't seem to care. He brought my hand to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to my knuckles. I'm just out of practice. At this. At everything. The vulnerability in his voice, the admission of his own uncertainty, was the most intimate thing he could have shared. It leveled the playing field, making us two men, fumbling our way out of our respective silences. He led me over to the worn leather armchair and sat down, pulling me onto his lap. It should have felt awkward, but it felt utterly natural. I settled against his chest, my head resting in the crook of his neck. His arms came around me, holding me securely. He was so warm, so solid. I could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against my ear. I closed my eyes and breathed in his scent, soap and sawdust and man. We didn't say anything for a long time. There was no need for words. The fire crackled, the electric lights hummed, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the silence was not empty. It was full. It was full of shared breath, and the beat of two hearts, and the overwhelming, peaceful feeling of being exactly where I was supposed to be. I had spent so long as an observer of my own life, sketching it from a safe distance. But here, in Arthur's arms, I was finally in the picture. And it was more vivid, more colorful, than anything I could have ever drawn. I drifted off to sleep right there, held safely in the arms of the quiet man from across the hall, the sound of his breathing a lullaby against the returning quiet of the world. I woke with a start. The light filtering through the window was the pale, gray light of early morning. For a disorienting moment, I didn't know where I was. The scent of old books and wood smoke, the unfamiliar weight of a heavy arm draped over my waist. Then it all came rushing back. Arthur. I was in his bed. I had a vague, dreamlike memory of him carrying me from the chair, of the soft mattress, the cool sheets. I was still fully clothed, as was he. He was lying on his side, spoon behind me, his body a warm, solid wall at my back. His breathing was deep and even, the sound a comforting rumble. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the warm fog of sleep. What have I done? The intimacy of the night before, so right and natural in the firelight and whiskey glow, now seemed terrifyingly real in the stark light of day. I was in a dead woman's bed. I was a temporary fix for a lonely man's grief. My mind, my old, cruel companion, started its familiar litany of doubts. He'll regret this. He'll wake up and see me and be filled with remorse. I'm a mistake. Quietly, carefully, I disentangled myself from his arm. He stirred, murmuring something in his sleep, but didn't wake. I slipped out of the bed, my feet silent on the cool wooden floor. His bedroom was as neat and sparse as the rest of his apartment. A tall dresser, a simple nightstand, and on it, another framed photo of him and Helen. This one was from their wedding day. They looked so young, so incandescently happy. I felt a wave of nausea. I didn't belong here. I fled. I crept out of his bedroom, through the living room where the embers in the fireplace were now just gray ash, and slipped out his front door. The hallway felt like a mile-long gauntlet. I fumbled with my own keys, my hands shaking again, and finally found refuge in my own apartment. The silence I returned to was the worst yet. It was accusatory. It mocked me. I paced my living room like a caged animal, the scent of him still clinging to my clothes, the feel of his lips still a ghost on mine. What was I thinking? He was a man grieving his wife, and I was what? An opportunity? A convenient distraction? The gentleness and vulnerability he had shown me now seemed like a trap my lonely heart had willingly walked into. Hours passed. I showered, scrubbing my skin until it was raw, trying to wash away his scent, to wash away the memory. I sat at my drafting table and stared at a blank page, my mind a maelstrom of regret and fear. I couldn't draw. The talking squirrels seemed to be mocking me. Around 9 o'clock, there was a soft knock on my door. My blood ran cold. It was him. I knew it was. I considered not answering. I could pretend I was asleep, pretend I wasn't home. I could hide. It was what I was good at. Hiding in my apartment, hiding in my work, hiding from life. But the memory of his forehead pressed against mine, of his voice whispering, "You weren't imagining anything," stopped me. Hiding was the old me, the me from before the storm. I took a deep breath and opened the door. Arthur stood there, fully dressed in his work clothes. He was holding 2 mugs of coffee, steam rising from them in the cool hallway air. He didn't look angry. He didn't look regretful. He just looked steady. His gray eyes were soft, but they held a searching quality. "You left," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. I started, but the words wouldn't come. I had to work. The lie was pathetic, and we both knew it. He held out one of the mugs to me. "I make terrible coffee," he said, a faint smile on his lips. "But it's hot." I took the mug. Our fingers brushed. The jolt was still there, a familiar, terrifying thrill. "Thank you. Can I come in, Leo?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Or are we going to have this conversation in the hallway?" I stepped back, wordlessly letting him in. He walked past me and sat at my small kitchen table, placing his mug down with a soft click. He looked completely at ease, as if he belonged there. I sat opposite him, my hands wrapped around the warm ceramic, a shield against my own anxiety. He watched me for a long moment, his gaze so direct and perceptive I felt like he could see every panicked thought scrolling through my mind. "I woke up," he began, his voice low and even. "And for the first time in 3 years, the first thought in my head wasn't that Helen was gone." He paused, letting the weight of that sink in. "My first thought was that you were there. And I felt calm. And then I realized you weren't there. And the calm was gone. My throat was so tight I couldn't speak." "I'm not good with words," he continued, looking down at his calloused hands on the table. "Not like you. You make worlds with them. I just fix things. But I need to try to fix this. Last night wasn't a mistake for me. It wasn't about me being lonely or you being convenient." He looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and they were fierce with sincerity. "It was about you. I saw the pictures." I finally managed to whisper, the words tasting like shame. "Of you and Helen. On the nightstand." A look of profound understanding washed over his face. He nodded slowly. "Helen was the love of my life," he said, his voice thick with emotion but steady. "I loved her for 30 years. That will never change. The man I was with her, he died when she did, in a way. I've spent 3 years living with his ghost." He leaned forward, his expression intent. "Last night, with you, I felt like maybe a new person could be born. Not a replacement. Something different. Something new." He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. His touch was warm and sure, an anchor in the storm of my anxiety. "I'm not asking you to compete with a memory, Leo. I'm asking you to help me build a future." Tears pricked my eyes. Tears of relief, of a hope so potent it was painful. All my fears, all my carefully constructed scenarios of rejection and regret, they were all just ghosts. The man in front of me was real. What he was offering was real. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice cracking. "Me too," he said, and his admission was a gift. "But I'm more scared of going back to that quiet apartment alone." The nosy neighbor, Mrs. Gable, became our first, albeit minor, test. A few days later, Arthur and I were leaving my apartment together on a Saturday morning, heading out to the farmer's market. It was a simple, domestic plan that filled me with a quiet, bubbling joy. As we stepped into the hallway, her door, 1A, which was conveniently located with a direct view of the third-floor landing, creaked open. "Good morning, boys," she chirped, her eyes darting between us, a hawk spotting 2 particularly interesting field mice. "Getting an early start, are we?" "Morning, Mrs. Gable," Arthur said, his voice perfectly level. He didn't miss a beat. He simply reached over and took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine. It was a bold, declarative act, a statement made for an audience of one nosy neighbor. My face instantly burned hot, but I didn't pull away. I squeezed his hand, a silent signal of solidarity. Her eyes widened almost comically, her gaze dropping to our joined hands, and then back up to our faces. The cogs were visibly turning in her head, connecting dots, rewriting narratives. "Well," she said, recovering with a tight little smile. "Have a lovely day." The door clicked shut. In the elevator, I finally let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "Well, the cat's out of the bag," I said, a nervous laugh escaping me. Arthur turned to me, his expression serious. "Does that bother you?" "A little," I admitted honestly. "I'm used to being invisible." "I'm not," he said simply. "And I don't want you to be invisible anymore. Not with me." He lifted our joined hands and kissed my knuckles, right there under the fluorescent lights of the descending elevator. And just like that, the fear of Mrs. Gable and her gossip seemed small and insignificant. Our life together began to take shape in a series of quiet, ordinary moments. We didn't have a grand conversation where we defined a relationship. We just lived it. We fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Most evenings, we'd end up in one apartment or the other. Sometimes we'd cook together in my slightly too small kitchen, bumping hips and stealing taste from the spoon. Other times, we'd sit in his leather armchair. It was big enough for both of us. And read, my legs tangled with his, the comfortable silence a testament to our growing ease. He started leaving things at my place. A toothbrush in the holder next to mine. A pair of his worn work boots by the door. Each item was a small anchor, tethering his life more securely to mine. And I started sketching him. While he read the paper, his brow furrowed in concentration. While he dozed by the fire, his face soft and unguarded in sleep. My sketchbook, once filled only with whimsical creatures, now held the reality of him, the beautiful, grounding truth of the lines on his face and the strength in his hands. One evening, he was looking over my shoulder as I worked on a new book proposal. The story was about a shy mole who was afraid of the sun. He lived his whole life underground until a patient, steady badger helped him see the beauty of the world above. Arthur traced the outline of the badger on my page with his finger. "He looks familiar," he said, his voice a low rumble in my ear. "He's just a badger," I said, my cheeks warm. "He's kind," Arthur observed. "And he's strong. And he's not afraid to wait for the mole to be ready." He pressed a kiss to my temple. "I like him." It was in these quiet moments that the last of my walls crumbled. The fear of intimacy, the armor I had worn for so long, simply melted away under the steady warmth of his love. He never pushed. He never demanded. He just was. He was present and patient, and his love was a quiet, constant thing, like the pilot light on a stove, always there, ready to burst into flame. A month after the storm, we were lying in his bed on a Sunday morning. The sun streamed through the windows, painting stripes of light across the sheets. This bed, which had once been a source of such terror for me, now felt like the safest place in the world. I was tracing the faint, silver scar on his back, the one I had noticed that first day. "How did you get this?" I asked softly. He shifted, turning to face me. He took my hand and held it against his chest, right over his heart. "Fell off a roof when I was 20, trying to impress a girl." "Was it Helen?" He smiled. "No, it was a girl whose name I can't even remember. I met Helen a year later. She used to say this scar was from my stupid youth, and she was the start of my smart adulthood." He spoke of her easily now, and I listened without a trace of insecurity. Her memory wasn't a ghost between us. It was a part of him, a part of the story that had led him to my door. "I love you, Leo," he said, his voice quiet but absolute in the sunlit room. The words were simple, unadorned, and they landed in the center of my chest with the weight of truth. "I love you, too, Arthur," I said, and the words felt as natural and as necessary as breathing. They were the truest thing I had ever said. He leaned in and kissed me, a slow, lazy morning kiss that was full of promise. It wasn't a kiss of desperate relief or tentative exploration. It was a kiss of comfortable, established love. A kiss that said, "This is home." Later that day, I was at my drafting table, putting the finishing touches on the mole and the badger. The final illustration was of the two of them, sitting on a small hill, watching the sunrise together. The mole was no longer squinting in fear, but looking at the light with a sense of wonder. The badger was beside him, a solid, protective presence, his gaze not on the sunrise, but on the mole's happy face. I looked at the drawing, and then I looked out my window. For the first time, I didn't just see the brick wall of the building next door. I saw the slice of blue sky above it. I thought of the man across the hall, the man who was no longer just a neighbor, but the landscape of my heart. He had knocked on my door asking for help with a simple, physical pain, and in doing so, had healed a deeper, quieter ache in me I hadn't even known how to name. My life was no longer a fortress of silence. It was a home, filled with the sound of his low voice, the smell of his terrible coffee, and the steady, reassuring beat of his heart next to mine. The quiet was still there, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was peaceful, and it was ours.